I want to welcome Walter Katz. He is the Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. He joined Arnold after 2 decades in public service, beginning with a 17-year tenure as a public defender in Southern California through 2017, and then he spent time as Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety in the administration of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. He oversaw he was one of the co-negotiators of the consent decree that we spent a lot of time talking about in our last sessions. Before that, earlier in his career, he was an independent police auditor for San Jose, California, and he was Deputy Inspector General for the County of Los Angeles, Offices of Inspector General. He has his law degree from the McGeorge School of Law at the University of Pacific and his undergrad degree from the University of Nevada, Reno. I asked him to kind of give the very big picture overview of what has changed in policing thinking and strategies since George Floyd. I mean, since last summer. Before that as well, but there's been this moment of reckoning in the United States, and I'm just kind of curious: is it sticking? Are we, after lots of promises and lots of protests last summer, are things reverting to the way they were, or are changes being made? So I've asked him to talk about that from a very big picture perspective. He is going to present. He's got a slide deck, present for 45 minutes. We have time for questions. It's 1 o'clock right now. We have him until 2:15. And so, Walter, I want to thank you very much and turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to be talking for about 45 minutes, Q&A, but I want to try to keep this as informal as possible, despite the fact that I've written remarks, despite the fact that there's a slide deck here. Really, this opportunity is for you as part of this fellowship, so feel free to interject with questions. For me, of course, this is kind of potential shootout at the OK Corral, because when I was with the mayor's office here in the city of Chicago, we're extraordinarily controlled about how and when we talk and who we talk to in the media. So this is actually really an awesome opportunity. I'm gonna say good afternoon, and on behalf of Arnold Ventures, I appreciate the welcome, Chris, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Arnold Ventures is really happy to support the National Press Foundation's fellowship, reporting on criminal justice in the age of George Floyd. As I said, I encourage you to ask any questions throughout our time together, and as we do this deep dive, hopefully a deep dive, into where we are today in the state of criminal justice about a year and a half after the murder of George Floyd. I understand that you spent the morning with many of my friends from the Crime Lab, as well as YAP and Children's Home and Aid, and Jadine Chow from Chicago Public Schools, for a deep dive into Choose to Change. During my 3 years at the mayor's office here in Chicago as Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety, one of the most memorable moments for me was making a successful pitch to the mayor to make the first commitment of public funding for Choose to Change. And that was driven in a great deal by the RCT that came out of the Crime Lab, which persuaded me, and I used that evidence to persuade the mayor, that this type of intervention, which combined mentorship plus CBT, made a ton of sense. That occurred in August of 2018. That initial $300,000 allocation led to an even larger public investment in 2019 that allowed for the expansion of the program to Chicago's West Side. Now, in full disclosure, I've been a trustee on the board of Children's Home and Aid since shortly after my departure from the mayor's office. So I do come at this with a degree of interest. We are here, though, this afternoon for a discussion about criminal justice in the age, actually the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. More specifically, we're going to mull over the question of what, if anything, has changed since May 25th of 2020. I will say this at the outset. Whether as the independent police auditor in San Jose or in working on the consent decree and violence prevention here in Chicago, I strongly believe that the progress rests on a three-legged stool that requires the fervent participation of activists and advocates, a robust press, and internal lever pullers who operate using David Brooks' terminology, at the edge of inside to be catalyst of change. I think, in my opinion, without all three working in tension with each other, progress and reform is really difficult to achieve. For those of you who may not be familiar with Arnold Ventures, LLC, it was formerly the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. We are a philanthropic organization dedicated to tackling some of the most pressing problems in the United States. We're based in Houston with offices in New York and Washington, D.C. We work in the areas such as health policy, higher education, public finance, and criminal justice. We invest in sustainable change, building it from the ground up on research, deep thinking, and a strong foundation of evidence. Our core mission is to invest in evidence-based solutions that maximize opportunity and minimize injustice. You can learn more about our work at arnoldventures.org. In criminal justice, we are three teams that focus respectively on pretrial justice, fines and fees, corrections and reentry, and policing, the team that I have the privilege to lead. Our vision for our work in policing is to advance reforms with the aim that police act in service to their communities by promoting community safety with a reverence for life and dignity, and upholding the constitutional and human rights of all persons, regardless of race, ethnicity, identity, or economic status. We have structured our work around two main pillars: improving police accountability and increasing community safety, with the latter focused on improving outcomes when responding to people in crisis, decreasing community violence, and increasing the commitment to understanding the intersection of guns and violence in our society. With that in mind, we are asking a handful of overarching questions. First is, what is happening in our criminal justice system that demands our attention? Why does violence concentrate? Why are victims of police violence disproportionately black and brown? With 18,000 police departments in the country, how do we effectively scale and advance reforms? While today I'd like to focus our discussion on improving police accountability, I would be remiss, though, to not also talk about violent crime, especially since the topic of violence and policing are so intertwined. Just let me check. When I'm standing up here, you can't see the screen, right? Okay, I'm keeping that in mind. I used to do jury trials for 15 years, so I'm really conscious of what juries are thinking and doing, so I noticed. We know that violence is, where am I now? We know that violence is the leading cause of death among young black men, 18 to 24 years old, primarily through gunfire. We also know that many violent crimes are not reported for a variety of reasons, including thinking that the police won't be able to help or because of distrust in police. Through a combination of factors, more than half of all murders of black Americans never lead to an arrest. And beyond the human toll, the cost of gun violence is staggering. One of the biggest challenges to racial justice and in understanding the phenomenon of gun violence in general is a lack of insight into the realities of gun violence that allows for too many people to assume that all black people are violent. Well, here's the truth. In Baltimore, and this isn't very different from Chicago, 0.75% of the population is involved in gang activity. But they account, that 0.75%, account for 58% of homicide involvement. That means either as a perpetrator or as a victim. Not only does gun violence concentrate among people, it also concentrates geographically. In Boston, a study by Anthony Braga, who I'm sure is going to be at ASC this week, showed that 70% of shootings clustered around 5% of street corners in that city. Now, why is this important? What do we know so far? We know it's the leading cause of death for a significant cohort of our population. We know that less than half of violent crimes are actually reported to the police, and we know that actually less than half of shootings of black Americans actually leads to an arrest. And we also know that it concentrates geographically and in terms of people. And I urge you to always keep that broader context in mind when thinking about violence, when thinking about gun violence, when thinking about urban violence, to absolutely keep those realities in mind. We also know that while gun homicides in places like Chicago get all the headlines, firearm death rates are higher in southern and western states. Of the 20 states with the highest homicides rate, 12 are in the South. Gun death rates are closely correlated with access to firearms. But along with that, there's also limited education opportunities, limited housing opportunities, limited economic opportunities. If you want to think carefully about gun violence, you need to think about potential underlying causes. When I walked a few blocks away from here in the mayor's office, from 2017 to 2019, about 25 months, every single time that somebody got shot in Chicago, I got an email. So over that 25 months, I got somewhere between 2,700 and 3,000 emails. When I'd wake up in the morning, when I thought about conditions, this weather out here would immediately make me think, good, it's cold, though probably less than 2 homicides today. That is how much conditions matter. When around Memorial Day rolls around, it gets hot and people are outside. Those are the weekends that I worried. Like, crap, what's going to happen overnight? And I'd wake up like clockwork, 5:15 every single morning, and read the overnight emails to get the context, to understand what was happening. But without understanding the context of concentration of violence, but the conditions that underlie violence, not just the short-term conditions of what's the temperature today, but deep-seated, long-term systemic conditions, it can't truly be understood. Now, we also know that rates of police-rated fatalities are higher in most of the same states, right, that you just saw a moment ago. Look at the states which have the highest gun death rates. You notice, for example, that Maryland and Illinois, the states that have Baltimore and Chicago, are not on here. And then look at rates of police killings by state. A pretty strong overlap. What you see over here beyond the blue, which is more pinkish, is police killing death rates for Black Americans. Now this is all comparative and relative, right? Because your x-axis does not actually have a number down there for death rates. So it serves more as a comparative, so please don't view it as I'm explaining the scientific evidence to you. But I think it has to be kept in mind that with 28,000 gun homicides in 2021 alone, you would think that police activity would be primarily focused on preventing and solving violence. In fact, police spend most of their time doing a lot of other things other than responding to investigating or preventing violence. Every year, there are about 10.5 million arrests. 10.5 million arrests every single year. For every 100 arrests, about 5 are for violent offenses. Of all the other offenses, so you take these other 95, put them over here into the right-hand block. Of all the other arrests, about 30 out of 100 are classified by the police as other non-traffic offenses, which is a vague catch-all category that includes public intoxication, disturbing the peace, trespassing offenses like that. And of course, once again, we see significant disparities, especially for low-level conduct. 58% of Americans believe the racial disparities by law enforcement are a significant problem. Almost 80% of Black respondents believe that. Over-policing, which includes aggressive, imprecise responses, tactics not tied to the problem they're trying to solve. Under-policing, which means resources not being focused on where they're most needed. Focusing on traffic stops and low-level offenses that drive the statistics of arrests rather than for solving violent crime. Enforcement of low-level conduct that would not be seen in other neighborhoods. For example, Chicago data showing that the concentration of citations for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk are all on the south and the west side, and that type of citation is almost never written on the north side of Chicago. Interestingly, when you really dig into the data about what, for example, Black Americans in urban or marginalized communities will tell you, they'll tell you about the tension between feeling over-policed, yet not feeling safe. There's a really great paper out there by Daniel Webster and Sonni Buggs from Johns Hopkins University talking about gun enforcement in Baltimore, where they did qualitative interviews with community members. And from there, they saw that phenomenon in stark reality. Look at the polling reported in the New York Times in North Minneapolis around the summer of 2020. The seeds for the defeat of the Minneapolis budget, of a Minneapolis measure to dismantle the police department and replace it with a new department was right there, right in that poll, North Minneapolis, where there are neighborhoods of concentrated lack of economic opportunity, concentration of violence. Those very residents were telling pollsters, we don't feel safe, but we also have too much police presence. What people have been asking for the longest time in marginalized communities is better police presence. I often think about this moment when I was with the mayor's office. We're down in South Shore at a community meeting. Myself, the police superintendent, some aldermen, forget who else was there, evening community meeting. A resident got up and she said something which has stuck with me ever since. She said, we want 3 things from police. 1, we want them to show up when we call them. 2, we want them to solve the problem. And 3, we want them to treat us respect while they're doing so. Now those 3 things aren't in tension with each other, right? Not by nature, but in practice, those occur all the time. Just take the second. We want them to solve the problem. Less than half of homicides involving Black Americans are solved. The problem's not being solved. Disrespect. 71% of Black Americans polled, I want to say it was the Urban Institute, may have been Gallup, sorry I don't have the citation with me, say that they feel that being disrespected by the police is a problem. Far higher proportion than white Americans. So clearly there is something occurring in neighborhoods where there is concentrated violence, which is more than just about violence in and by itself. It is what happens during these nonviolent arrests that has animated the struggle for policing that recognizes its blind spots, improves its practices and culture, it makes amends for the harm it has disproportionately inflicted on people of color. The murder of George Floyd on May 25th of 2020 and subsequent national protests drew a historical level of attention in criminal justice reform and racial justice at the federal, state, and local levels. This acceleration carried over into the 2021 legislative sessions, creating a unique and all too short window to advance our criminal justice policy priorities. Along with the demand for change came the unique challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and the startling increase in homicides and aggravated assaults. I said it very specifically for a reason. In 2020, nationwide, homicides increased by 30%. Aggravated assaults increased by a very close number. Please do not write violent crime increased, because the UCR numbers show that violent crime, which takes all type 1 violent crimes, including robberies, assaults, sexual assaults, homicides, etc., that actually violent crime dropped slightly in 2020. The increase came in homicides and aggravated assaults. Difference? Yes. Does it matter? Yes. The narrative actually really matters. Now, the reforms we saw during COVID-19 and the aftermath of the protests were sweeping changes that passed at a scope and breadth we have not seen before across all criminal justice policy areas, including police accountability, citation authority for the police, jail conditions, community supervision, fines and fees, etc. And even before, and of course after Floyd's murder, we're asking this question. How, with 18,000 police departments in America, do we advance police reforms that strengthen accountability and increase transparency? We already knew, as we were thinking about policing issues at Arnold Ventures, we already knew that an unarmed black man is 3.5 times more likely to be shot by a police officer than an unarmed white man. 3.5 times. And when this misconduct is proven, a recent study showed that nearly half of police union contracts mandate their removal of discipline records over time. And other states like California, law enforcement officer Bill of Rights offer that protection statutorily. Later on, I'm going to connect all this together, okay? You may be asking, well, wait a minute. Why did he just jump from fatal encounters of unarmed black men versus white men is 3.5 times higher, and what does that have to do with discipline? I'll get to that. According to an analysis by the Urban Institute, only 30% of residents surveyed in high-crime, low-income neighborhoods believe that police respect people's rights. Yet, people living in such communities say that they want a police presence to respond to crime. The challenges to accountable policing lie within a web of policies and practices at the municipal and department level and legislation at the state level. Policies vary from one department to another, and police union contracts often erect significant hurdles to holding officers accountable that are not visible to the public. State laws have a significant impact on local conditions, including but not limited to collective bargaining processes that allow for bargaining of discipline provisions, restrictions on the management's ability to investigate misconduct, and state-level law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. In fact, I would urge that if you were on the policing beat focused on the police department, like one in particular, please read the collective bargaining agreement. Read the CBA, because it's within the CBA where all the conditions are to a great extent, which define when can an investigation be started, how soon can a complaint be filed, is there an affidavit requiring the complainant to file an affidavit under penalty of perjury for the complaint to be investigated? How soon do investigators have to start the investigation? How many people can interview the officer at any one time? After an officer-involved shooting, how much rest time does an officer get before he has to be interviewed? 2 hours, 24 hours, 1 week? All those are possible. But unless you read that contract, you will not understand the context of what's going on behind you when, for example, after an officer-involved shooting, the chief stands in front of the microphone and says, please hold your judgment until the investigation is complete. The next question should be, when do you estimate that the investigation is going to be complete? Well, it's going to take a while. How soon will it be before you can interview the officers about what happened? That's the key question. Because in some jurisdictions, I know, those interviews sometimes don't happen for months at a time. Are the officers allowed to confer with each other before the interview? Can they share counsel? Right? I used to be a criminal defense attorney. I know exactly what I would do. If I'm joint labor counsel for 2 officers involved in a shooting, I'm going to go talk to one. It's going to be a separate interview, a separate conversation. I'll go talk to the other one. That'll be a separate conversation. They're not supposed to talk to each other, but I have attorney-client privilege, and no one's going to know what I said. And once they're interviewed, lo and behold, you may have incredibly aligned statements during that interview. Not saying you will, but you could. What I am emphasizing is that the devil is in the details of collective bargaining agreements, department policies, and state-level law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. Those all interrelate with each other. And I spent years, either in Los Angeles County or San Jose's police auditor, digging through shootings, complaint investigations, and saw firsthand, right, how that interplay works. So I kind of took a sidebar here, but you all are reporters, and if you're going to be reporting on misconduct, that is where the infrastructure is for what you're seeing take place on the surface. So understanding the ways in which state policy, the ways in which state laws influence the management of policing and the accountability of officers is vital to assessing their impact. Police officer disciplinary records only made public in just over a dozen states. Police advocates use their bargaining and lobbying power to ensure officer privacy and to control how their disciplinary information is disseminated. Weak and inconsistent state decertification rules, including an absence of robust state boards like those that govern other professions, the medical profession, the legal profession, etc., means that officers with records of serious misconduct can get hired at other departments. I'll be talking about that. That's a phenomenon called the wandering officer. I'll be getting to that in a bit. LEOBAR, or Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, provisions with broad scopes hinder accountability, with features such as investigation waiting periods, prohibitions on the use of non-sworn investigators in misconduct investigations, pre-disciplinary hearings that include rank-and-file officers on the hearing board, and the statute of limitations on the retention and use of data on officer misconduct. An analysis of 178 union contracts by Stephen Russian, he's a professor of law right up the road at Loyola University of Chicago at their law school. His study found the significant portion of contracts limit officer interrogations after alleged misconduct, mandate the destruction of disciplinary records, ban civilian oversight, prevent anonymous civilian complaints, indemnify officers in the event of civil suits. Let me pause there for a second. Let's talk about indemnification. There's been a ton of conversation over the last year plus about qualified immunity, right? What is qualified immunity? It's a defense. It's essentially a motion brought by an agent of the state, could be a local employee of any sort, here we're talking about police officers, who has done some sort of act which has led to a civil rights violation lawsuit filed by the plaintiff. And the officer files a motion to say, this case should be dismissed because I have qualified immunity. And what does that mean? It means one of two things. Either the conduct I did was not an apparent violation of civil rights, and number two, it was not well-settled law. And the court, by diving into that question of well-settled law, looks to other cases within that circuit and determines, was there another case which was similar enough to the one which is in question here, which found a constitutional violation, which should have put the officer on notice that his conduct is unconstitutional. And that has led to further and further hair splitting, where you see even examples where, for example, after a pursuit, a police dog is let go on a suspect who seems to be surrendering, and he suffers severe dog bites from the police dog, and the person is saying, I was sitting up with my hands raised. And the officer says, qualified immunity. And the court says, the closest case that we could find is where somebody was laying down and surrendering. That he was sitting up is distinguished enough that the officer is not on notice that releasing the police dog to go bite the suspect would not be unconstitutional. Now, we can go round and round in example after example of where qualified immunity was granted, sometimes justified, sometimes not. But beneath that veneer, there's a missing piece in the public conversation. And that missing piece is about officer indemnification. This city pays out millions of dollars per year in law enforcement-related litigation. So does Los Angeles. So does New York. So do most cities, if not millions, hundreds of thousands. UCLA law professor Gianna Schwartz did an analysis of all those litigation payouts, either settlements, mostly, or verdicts. More than 99.5% of damages against individual officers were indemnified by their employer, the government, the taxpayer. I wanted to emphasize that because one of the biggest arguments against reforming qualified immunity is that it harms police officers and puts their economic livelihood at risk. They could lose their home, they could destroy their family, etc. 99.5% plus is indemnified by the employer. The reality is that beyond the rhetoric, based upon the history of payouts, the officers are not actually a financial risk. That indemnification can lay in the city or county charter, it could be in a union contract, it could be in policy, but unless the officer has really engaged in egregious conduct where the employer can say that was so far beyond the pale of what was expected, of what his duties and responsibilities were, indemnification generally will occur. Let me go on. So, interestingly, this question of understanding how these structural rules influence officer conduct has emerged only recently. So there's not a great deal of research on it. The research I've looked at points towards a negative impact of misconduct and the use of force as a relationship between that and collective bargaining. Police union provisions can help explain variations in police abuse, according to a paper written by Abdul Rad on police institutions and police abuse. A recently published study on fatal police encounters found, quote, that after officers gained access to collective bargaining rights, that there was a substantial increase in the killings of civilians. The study associated the timing of the adoption of collective bargaining agreements amongst Florida sheriff's offices with increases in violent misconduct. That paper, co-authored partially by John Rappaport, who was down the street, not up the street, down the street, University of Chicago, discovered this interesting nuance in Florida law, where sheriff's deputies got collective bargaining rights in Florida before municipal police officers did. So they were able to do a difference in differences study to take a look at the difference between increased use of force by officers versus sheriff's deputies, and they do believe that they found a relationship between the two. The authors found differences in allegations of violent misconduct by comparing state-level agency data and concluded our quasi-experimental results are consistent with the observation made earlier that CBAs contain provisions beyond those in Florida's Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights that make investigations more difficult and less likely to result in significant sanctions. In other words, the incentive structure has been altered. And as a result of the altering of the incentive structure, it looks like the effect was increased use of force and misconduct. Now, I've talked a lot about law and policies and intricacies, urge you to read collective bargaining agreements. This stuff is really complicated, but there's another really important aspect to it. And that aspect is that people have a stronger memory of negative experiences than a positive experience. So here I just want to take a moment to talk about what's the effect on people. When I was the police auditor in San Jose, I did quite a lot of community outreach, community meetings, etc. And there's this little exercise I did when I did those talks to the community. I'd ask people, if you've ever had a police encounter, please raise your hand. And hands will go up in the room. If you've had that encounter you thought about was a positive encounter, keep your hand up in the air. Some hands would drop, hands would stay up. If you remember every detail, was my next question. If you remember every detail of that good encounter, keep your hand in the air. Most hands came down. And then I'd say, if you dropped your hand earlier and you had a bad encounter, put your hand back up. Hands went back up. If you remember every detail of that bad encounter, keep your hand up. Almost no hands dropped. I remember sometime between the age I was like 20 and 22, I got stopped by the police 3 or 4 times. Once as a law clerk working for the former district attorney of where I grew up and went to college. I was making a court run to go file some papers. Went to my car, walked about 2 steps, and I thought, did I lock the door to my car? And checked, leaned back, well, kept on walking. Police car hits reverse and comes down the hill, backing up, and the guy hops out. What are you doing? Well, the way you look into your car made me think that maybe you're thinking of breaking into it. WTF. That was like 1 of 3 encounters. Me, law student, doing this thing, that is reality. People remember every detail. And people who have negative encounters will tell other people around it. So there's an implicit network effect. Let me get back to my place where I was. Broad cultural memory. This mural is about a mile from my house in Brooklyn. It's Spike Lee's production offices. I live in Bed-Stuy, a few blocks away from where Do the Right Thing was filmed. It's a movie. But it put a spotlight on police-community relations, which may be hard to miss what that movie was actually about. Because that movie, in my view, was about cultural memory. Walter Scott, in 2015. Jonathan Farrell in South Carolina. Jonathan Farrell, North Carolina, 2013. If you're a Black American in North Carolina, you will know about Jonathan Farrell. Football player, college graduate. One night his car broke down. Knocked on the door asking for help because his car broke down. That person became afraid. She calls the police. Police officer arrives. He thinks help is coming. He's jogging towards the police officer. Police officer sees a threat. Draws his weapon, opens fire, kills Jonathan Farrell. Walter Scott. If you're in South Carolina or anywhere, as a Black American, you know his story. Pulled over for a broken taillight. He had some stupid outstanding warrant, and he started running away. Taser came out. There had been some struggle over the taser. He got away. He started running away. Shot dead. And then the officer moves his taser, doesn't check on Mr. Scott. He's dying. He moves the taser next to him to make it look like the officer is defending his life from Walter Scott. What the officer didn't know is that there was somebody behind the fence who was videotaping everything which occurred. And but for that video, I guarantee you he would have gotten away with it. Fred Hampton, Rakia Boyd, Quintonio LeGrier, Betty Jones. If you're in the South or West Side of Chicago, you know exactly what those names mean, let alone Laquan McDonald. These stories go generation to generation, person to person. They are not in a vacuum. They are not separate data points for splitting apart and be saying, well, he shouldn't have ran. Well, Philando Castile shouldn't have reached for his registration. Fill in your excuse or the reason. The backdrops of the origins of policing, which in some parts of the country, not all, but some parts of the country, were slave patrols, were about protection of white communities from Black slaves. Controlling behavior through violence was the norm. That was transferred to the enforcement of Jim Crow. Voting rights protests. driving too fast in the Foothill Freeway in Los Angeles and not stopping, protesting the murder of George Floyd. The backdrop shapes how people in those communities perceive the police. When people see a police officer from the Barclays Center in Brooklyn pull down the mask of a young black man protesting and spraying him point blank in the face with OC spray for no reason whatsoever, one can see it, well, that is an unjustified use of force. But for a lot of other people, history informs the present. Every incident of unjustified use of force adds to the body of history. If police want to increase trust, they have to not only account for the past, but for the present as well. Now, where there is an effort at reconciliation, there have been positive results. But reconciliation has to be authentic, long-term, and with an extraordinary amount of empathy for those people who've been harmed. So, with about half of those 18,000 agencies having fewer than 10 officers, the answer to scalable change lies in the fact that only about 50 state legislators. The position that we took last year following the murder of George Floyd is that policing is a high-risk profession, but that is not regulated like one. The shock of Minneapolis and the nationwide focus on law enforcement policy that followed kicked off this unprecedented state legislative response. Over the next year, more than 3,000 bills were considered across all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia. Most policy that guides policing practices have generally been drafted by law enforcement agencies themselves, with some oversight from the cities and counties that fund them. That leaves a patchwork of policies, directives, standard operating procedures, and general orders with little transparency into whether they are in line with best practices or went through a rulemaking process that one would see in other high-risk activities and professions. Now, how it works is that between 2014 and 2017, there's a pretty fast rush towards pushing new policies, be it body-worn cameras, limitation and use of force. Some states improved data collection. So a lot occurred to try to, quote-unquote, reform policing. So when an officer killed a black man in Minneapolis, George Floyd, in broad daylight, while on camera, seemingly with impunity, a lot of people asked why, after all these reported reforms, was this able to happen? Well, since then, it kind of became clear that the officer who killed George Floyd was known as an unusually rough officer who had used similar force on other people before, but without consequences. In fact, this May, the Department of Justice filed a federal indictment alleging that in 2017, that same officer violated the civil rights of a 14-year-old boy where the officer held the boy by the throat and struck him multiple times in the head with his flashlight. And then, according to the federal indictment, held his knee on the neck and upper back of the teenager, even after the teenager was lying prone, handcuffed, and unresisting, also resulting in bodily injury. According to local prosecutors, the body camera footage showed the officer kneeling on the boy's back for 17 minutes, despite his pleas that he couldn't breathe. The Minneapolis Police Department never held Officer Derek Chauvin accountable for this alleged assault. And less than 3 years later, George Floyd was dead. In isolation, it is perhaps easy to label this officer as a rogue officer or a bad apple. But it brings to mind the words of organizational psychologist and former NBA player John Amechi, who says, "Culture is defined by the worst behavior you tolerate. Unchecked police misconduct undermines trust and legitimacy of policing, and now I turn it back to the violence question I started at the beginning, its ability to prevent and investigate crime. If you don't trust, why would you cooperate? So I'm going to not go through a ton of details which I had in terms of a lot of the legislation that was passed. But I would say that the change in the tenor of the politics can't be overlooked. Entering into 2022, we are following these four strategic priorities: strengthen accountability systems, increase transparency and community participation, reduce use of force, and to decrease racial disparities. We're going to see whether movement advocates continue to prioritize the more ambitious agenda, such as defunding the police, in the face of caution from moderate voters and elected officials. New York City is going to have a new mayor who ran on safety and reform. Earlier this month, voters rejected the Minneapolis Police Department, rejected the ballot measure to replace the Minneapolis Police Department, but elsewhere voters made pro-reform votes in Austin, in Cleveland, as well as in Albany, New York. So we'll see, in general, how the trend plays out. What we have seen, though, is really a weaponization of police reform, which has come around in a couple of different ways. One has been that opponents of reform have tried to demonize Black Lives Matter. Second, this thing called critical race theory, CRT, has been weaponized. So we have one segment of our cohort which does not believe that climate change exists or that vaccines work, but believes that critical race theory is brainwashing our kids. So that's the kind of the milieu that we're living in right now, where there's been significant pushback against reforms, especially against the backdrop of increased violence. So that context is going to have to be understood as we move into 2022. Our approach here has been a both-and strategy. Voters want evidence-based solutions to public safety concerns, and they want a more equitable, accountable criminal justice system. Centering that dual message is the guiding principle of our work. So I am almost over time. So I will, actually I'm going to stop here and let's just dive into questions.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I wanted to ask for your thoughts on the Minneapolis ballot amendment. One thing that stuck out to me in covering it was that you pointed this out. There are a number of Black voters who said, I'm in favor of police reform because I have experience with police violence, but perhaps this is a bridge too far. I just kind of wanted to know, what you make of it and perhaps what other cities might be able to learn from Minneapolis as they try next year to advance their own police reforms. What went wrong? Perhaps what was done well.
I thank you for that question. I think the fundamental challenge is that voters, especially impacted communities, weren't sure what comes in replacement, right? So there's language in the ballot measure that there might be police if necessary. If you're living in a community which has concentrated violence, you're wondering, well, what's going to happen in terms of if I call for help, who's going to be there? So that's that exact tension there between I feel like I'm being over-policed, yet I'm also in fear of under-policing, even though I don't have a lot of trust in what I have already. So I think that nuance has to be worked out. And that's why I talked about that both-and strategy.
Hi, thank you. I'm Emily, also based out of New York. My question actually built off that last one. I guess my concern of reporting on police reform is police departments have a long history of requesting more money and resources for reform, and we are where we are today with extreme police budgets. And I think police also have a lot of power in the media to continue that cycle. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the mainstreaming of the police abolition movement, the defund movement, and what it means to have alternatives that aren't playing into the funding of police departments for them to reform themselves when we haven't seen much progress so far?
Oh my goodness, let me see if I can do that in 45 seconds. Okay, so a couple things in play. One, in police budgets, what's the reality here? Oh yeah, next to the collective bargaining agreement, if you're doing police reporting, know your police department's budget inside and out. The reality is that most public safety budgets, personnel costs are more than 90% of the costs, right? Benefits are usually in another part of the budget, but 90% plus. So for example, when I was in the mayor's office of Chicago, the mayor made a commitment, Mayor Emanuel made a commitment that every police officer in the department would have a body-worn camera. Now, you already have a fixed number of police officers, that's 90% plus of your budget. You also know that getting a body-worn camera for every officer, plus also maintaining a yearly contract with Axon, for example, costs money as well. So how are you going to pay for that? And if you're going to cut back, where are you going to cut back on? So those are the tensions which, as a former policymaker, I had to be extraordinarily conscious of, right? Aldermen, the 50 city councilmen in Chicago, if you decrease their number of officers in their district, they'll be calling right away. In terms of the defund movement and the alternatives movement, I would say that the defund movement initially thought their ambiguity was the power in their language, right? If you go back to kind of to Twitter in June of 2020, there's like, what exactly is defund? Abolitionists were saying defund is kind of that stepping stone towards eliminating policing. Other people were saying, no, defund is more of a stand-in phrase to stand in for decreased funding in policing and increased investments elsewhere. But it conditioned the investments elsewhere in alternative strategies, such as crisis response, conditioned it on decreasing the police budgets. My view, if we have a long-term view of narrowing the footprint of policing, it should require a couple of things. First, of course, is the demand of effective and accountable policing. So no matter what the size of police departments are, we should be requiring that. Second of all, I believe that we should be able to stand up those alternatives, right, so that they are freestanding and have their own funding stream and have a chance to become successful. And then as we scale those up, that we then have a critical evaluation of what forms of policing do we actually need. If we look at how police spend their time, which is a really critical thing to be doing, if only 5% of all arrests are for violent crime and a significant portion are for other, we know that not a lot of time is spent in responding to emergency calls. Then there should be a critical examination of, well, are these sizes of these police budgets really required? But that's going to require, in my view, kind of a real nitty-gritty kind of cost-benefit analysis conversation, which necessarily a quick slogan is not going to solve for.
Hello, my name is Philip Jackson from the HuffPost. So I kind of wanted to start my question off because I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about the correlation of police officers who violate department policy and then criminal convictions. And I ask that because, you have departments throughout the country who take suggestions from groups like you, groups like Campaign Zero about what policies they should institute and then what they should just completely ban or get rid of and stop practicing. One, for example, body cameras. Another, for example, officers shooting into moving vehicles and kind of how that it turns vehicles into a missile and it impacts residents and certain things like that who aren't even involved into whatever incident is going on. When officers, they do these types of things, if you talk to somebody on the ground, like a resident who lives in that neighborhood community where it happened or a protester, they would think, oh, this cop violated this policy, he should automatically be convicted. But if you speak to a state prosecutor or attorney, that's not the case. And a lot of that is connected to the law, state law, certain things like that. Yep. So I just kind of want to hear your thoughts about that scenario that it seems like a lot of these shootings are kind of trapped in almost.
Yeah, let me focus on shooting in a moving vehicle. I'm going to use that as kind of the stand-in for the broader conversation. Once I was in a meeting, not here, elsewhere, where a local prosecutor who was basically in charge of the section which was responsible for evaluating officer-involved shootings said what the standard is for them. The standard is for them, before they even file charges for officers, is beyond a reasonable doubt plus. Those were his words. And what he meant by that is that they so viewed juries as being deferential, his explanation, to officers, that they wouldn't even want to seek charges unless it was just more than beyond a reasonable doubt, but plus that. They want to be that sure that, an illegal shooting had occurred. Now, this was back in the mid-2010s, I'd say in 2014 and 2013, around then. And since then, we have seen more prosecutors who are willing to file charges on shootings that truly seem questionable. I think shooting at a moving vehicle, is one of the best examples. There's departments which expressly prohibit that. But in almost every department policy that you read on prohibiting shooting at a motor vehicle, there's a caveat at the end. And that caveat tends to be unless the officer's life was in danger, etc. And so you see instances where officers will place themselves in a position of danger, like in front of the vehicle, or they reach into an open door, an open window, the car starts moving or inches ahead, and they view that as a threat. The most dangerous part, and I've been at shooting scenes like this when I was in oversight, is where an officer is in front of the car is moving towards them, and he starts firing into it, and there's passengers in the car. So it's a moving target, 3,000 pounds plus. You're shooting into that moving target, and who knows whether or not you hit the driver or not, or if instead you'll hit a passenger. And so really, there are only very few examples. Now, what occurred is that there's a generally strong trend towards prohibiting shooting vehicles until the truck attack occurred in Nice, France. I'm going to say that was somewhere around 2018 or so, if I have my chronology right. And that gave police departments pause to say, well, there are circumstances where it would seem to be appropriate to use use gunfire to stop a moving vehicle. But the question is the exception so large to swallow the rule? But yeah, I think prosecutors tend to be reluctant to file those charges because unless they can actually show malicious intent by the officer, they tend to be very deferential to the officer's belief that he has to defend himself.
Hi, I'm Joseph with the Arizona Republic in Phoenix. This actually dovetails a bit into what you were just talking about right now. So, covering police from, we have the DOJ investigation right now into Phoenix police. And one of the things I think is frustrating for a lot of people on the reform side is that we talk a lot about, even your presentation talks a lot about, police reforms, what we can do about police reforms and the history of police, but very little talk about the influence that DAs have on police reform. And so obviously I understand the practicality of like how DAs and police agencies work side by side, but is there a reason why even when it comes to these federal investigations, there is such a firewall between the two?
When you said a federal investigation is a firewall between the local prosecutor and the police or the DOJ?
Yeah, so for example in Phoenix, right? So one of the things that they're looking at is the use of charging protesters as gangs, right? That is obviously a DA decision, but it's being done it's only being looked at the police level. So I guess a lot of people wonder why the hell not also look at police, reform as also a DA reform.
So basically you're taking the intro to Law and Order and saying, well, yeah, and I think that's a fair question. When you have a situation where it does seem that there is, I don't want to use the word collusion because I have no evidence of that, but where there's a close symbiotic relationship between, for example, charging decisions, especially if it's politically motivated charging decisions like in Phoenix, I think that's a relevant question if there are practices by the agency which come into question. So, for example, the consent decree here we negotiated in Chicago, it doesn't only apply to the Chicago Police Department. There are provisions in the consent decree that we negotiated with the Illinois Attorney General's office, which also apply to reforms that have to take place within the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, the Investigations Office, which investigates use of force. One challenge is, though, is that the pattern and practice investigations tend to be against the jurisdiction. So, in your instance, it's the city of Phoenix, and I'm assuming your prosecutor's the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office, or whatever they call it. Well, if the potential defendant is the city of Phoenix, you'd actually have to file a joint investigation, if you're the DOJ, against the Maricopa County District Attorney, and as well as the Phoenix Police Department. Don't know whether or not, I can't speak for the DOJ whatsoever in terms of what their thinking is and what they're seeing.
Hi, I'm Akasia. I'm with the Associated Press in Austin. I cover the intersection of criminal justice and politics in Texas. And a lot of what we've seen is politicizing of a lot of these cases by people like Greg Abbott, our state governor, our Speaker of the House, some of the representatives. And we saw politicizing to the degree that we saw bills to increase police funding and bills to decrease police funding, and the ones to increase were given so much attention that they passed, and the ones to decrease were given so little attention that they didn't even get out of committee. So how can we, as a media, humanize these stories to take them out of that way in which they're being politicized by large-scale politicians with a specific bias? How can we humanize them in a way that we can inform of what's happening with taking it out of that very political lens?
Yeah, I think that's extraordinarily difficult to do, because I think for advocates for reform, for advocates for decreased funding and investing elsewhere, it's political also. I think, let me come at it from a different direction. I think it's really important to challenge blanket assumptions that are thrown around. So, for example, when homicides increased by a significant portion that they did in 2021, unprecedented increase, right? For some folks, it was easy to argue to say, well, that's because of decreased police funding. Okay, but the data shows that those increases in homicides were across the country, regardless of whether or not funding was increased. So I think that's the first. The second is to humanize the story of what does police presence actually mean, right? And it goes back to this tension between over-policing and under-policing. I just don't think that can be emphasized enough. What it is like to live in a community where you don't feel safe walking on your own street at night, yet you also have this twinge of not feeling safe if you call the police to come solve a problem. And I think that's where the story lies, in hearing from those voices of people who are most impacted by increases and decreases in police spending.
Hi, my name's Sam. I'm a reporter at Mother Jones in California. And I wanted to ask a question about police unions. So you mentioned how police unions make it really hard to hold officers accountable after misconduct, and even to fire them is really hard because of arbitration that goes into place with the unions. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit about, if we're all recognizing that these unions are a big problem, what do you see as the solution? Do we need to get rid of police unions? Do cities just have to do a much better job negotiating? Do we need new laws? And also, what are the challenges to fixing that problem?
Yeah, well, quick plug. I just had an article published in the SMU Law Review about that very question, about collective bargaining and participatory democracy. So the position I took was that abolishing police unions means you're abolishing a public union. And to open that door in one place will open that door elsewhere. So I'll just say that. But I think it's the lens that we should be looking at collective bargaining with. I don't think that police unions, are necessarily doing anything wrong per se. They are zealously advocating on behalf of their membership to protect their members as much as possible. That's kind of their job. We can disagree with the details, but that's their job. But my question is, who is on the other side of that negotiation, right? And I've, here in this city, have participated in some collective bargaining negotiations. And the question is that which I raised in the article, was a couple things. One, these processes are generally not transparent. Some states have sunshine laws. For example, Florida has a sunshine law, but I don't think it's very well implemented, which allow for the public to have insight in what is going on in the negotiations. You could have requirements that, for example, the initial offer by both sides is published. So it's public, so people know what the negotiating positions are. You could increase public participation. for example, by actually having people in the most marginalized communities who are most impacted by policing to be able to sit in or observe or actually participate in negotiations. Austin is a perfect example of that, where the Austin Justice Coalition about 3-4 years ago really pushed their way into the bargaining table, really understood Texas law and said, we have a right to be here. That exact measure, which the voters passed down in Austin 2 weeks ago, was the backlash to that, to demand that the city of Austin hires 500 more officers. But the voters said no. The last area I touch on, greater transparency, public participation. The third is to really examine this concept in collective bargaining of understanding how are things negotiated. There are parts of collective bargaining for public unions which are mandatory, like wages and working conditions and benefits. There are parts that are prohibited, which can't be negotiated whatsoever, and that's defined by state law. But the third area, the one in the middle, is the one which is most intriguing, and that's the area of permissive bargaining. It's not demanded by the statute, but nor is it prohibited. And that is where all the accountability and transparency measures tend to show up, because they're not about wages, benefits, and work conditions. So, for example, in Illinois House Bill 3653, the Safety Act, where that bill created a robust decertification regime in the state of Illinois for officers found guilty of committing misconduct. There's a particular provision in the decertification language that says that decertification is not subject to collective bargaining. With one sentence, it made that prohibited bargaining. So really understanding of what is allowed, what is not allowed, and narrowing that footprint, I think is the key. But I'd say first and foremost, remember this. On one side, you have police unions negotiating, on one side, they're advocating for their members. It is your city, your mayor, who's negotiating, your corporate council on the other side, and then it's being ratified by city council. Do they understand what they're ratifying? Have they taken the time to really think about it? Have they pushed back against anything that was negotiated? Or are they simply acting as a rubber stamp for whatever came out of the negotiation room?
Thank you for doing this. Oh, sorry, I'm over here. Hey.
Oh, hey, hi.
My name's Akayla Elise. I'm a reporter with The Intercept.
Yeah.
So Arnold Ventures had previously funded this aerial investigative program in Baltimore, and I think in January, you all pulled funding from that. And I wanted to ask about why that decision was made and why you all funded that program in the first place, but specifically why you decided to pull the funding.
It was a time-limited grant, and we also had time-limited funding both for the analysis done by RAND as well as the analysis by the policing project from NYU to look at community impact. So it was an experiment, and we got the results, and that was the end of that project. As we said at the beginning, we will invest in innovative ideas. We're focused on, is it effective? Does it protect people's rights? What can we learn from it? And that's, we've learned some things from it, and we've moved on.
Hi, I'm Steve Janowski from The Record in New Jersey. I was just curious what you thought about the Camden Police Department, about the disbandment and the kind of reformation of it afterwards. Was that a success in your opinion? Because I've heard it both ways.
Yeah, I think if we look at the results afterwards as to, what was the perception and what did the data show about that department ahead of time, before the disbandment, and then the new department that came into it afterwards, it looks like success in terms of community safety, in terms of use of force and misconduct. But it also goes to show that leadership really matters, right? So I don't know whether had Scott Thompson been hired as the police chief of the Camden Police Department, whether or not he would have received the same results without disbanding and reforming and creating a brand new department. But it's an interesting question, and maybe it's a question that not enough other municipalities have considered if they have an agency which is really struggling to turn the corner.
Hi, Stefania Lugli with Wichita Beacon in Kansas. So a lot of initiative in our police department is justified or motivated by the prevention of crime, but a lot of these policies or initiatives kind of allow for surveillance of everyday behavior that leaves it open to criminal interpretation. So my question is, can crime prevention by our police department be efficient without infringing on the right to expression and privacy, or does a sacrifice have to be made by a community to help prevent future deaths?
I'm not sure if it can be such a distinct either or. There's a lot there. The question of surveillance, what's the cost, what are the benefits? In terms of benefits, is it effective? Has to be asked, and then the social harms have to be weighed. I think that there's an underlying question, which is, what are the criteria used by policymakers to determine whether or not to implement a particular policy or not? And who are the decision makers? Is the decision maker simply just within the police department itself? Or does it involve a broader set of stakeholders, including community stakeholders? When we toss around phrases like co-production of public safety, what do we actually mean by that? Do we mean that authentically or not? I mentioned policing project a few moments ago. Barry Friedman, head of the policing project at NYU, he calls it front-end accountability, which really is saying, for example, there is some new technology which the department wants to use, which could have some free expression or privacy implications. How do we assess that? Who is at the table to determine whether or not that should be adopted? So I think if there is a new technology which is used, or something which, hey, this is going to be effective, there should be some deep research attached to it to actually assess effectiveness and also assess social harms.
I'm Emily Wilder with the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. My question regards SB 2, the law that was just passed by California that gives state regulators a process through which they can decertify cops found guilty of serious misconduct. And it's been lauded as a really positive reform because California is one of 4 states in the country that doesn't have a process yet for that. But I've heard critics saying that it's basically toothless because it relies on, it's up to interpretation what serious misconduct means, and it relies on departments, on officers either being found guilty through sustained findings by departments or criminal convictions, which are obviously really rare. So I'm wondering whether you think that SB 2, whether you have hopes that it'll be effective, and if not, what more needs to be done?
Yeah, I think actually decertification, and that was the last part, well, my presentation went long. Decertification to me is actually one of the most important regulations that a state could take on when we're thinking about those kind of regulations that can increase accountability. The reason I think it's important is that if you have a weak decertification process, the only incentive that there is against misconduct is the risk that your own department will discipline you, right? When I was a public defender in Southern California, you could be in the attorney lockup in, for example, the criminal courts building, and you'd hear a lawyer every so often after some client made some ridiculous request to do something which was clearly unethical or maybe even illegal. You heard a lawyer saying, that is not worth losing my bar card over. That kind of disincentive matters. Well, for police officers, if there is no disincentive to misconduct, there's no risk of losing your certification. If that incentive is there for good behavior because of decertification risk, that's a good thing. So I think it's a normative thing. SB 2 was really important. In terms of SB 2 and the substance of it, I think it did a couple of really smart things. First of all, it has a centralized location which is making decisions, right? And that's mainly through that intermediary advisory committee, which then reports up the post itself. I think that has a lot of value. The challenge is, of course, it always goes down to that question of who determines whether or not misconduct has actually occurred. And I think there's going to be some devil in the details as we implement it. I think Illinois, which has done something similar, we're going to see it there as well. I think that all in all, I think SB 2 was a net plus. I think unless you're creating some sort of alternative investigation apparatus, which will have authority to investigate statewide, I don't think the outcomes will necessarily be that different. We've not seen that in terms of having it may or may not be, right? And I'm trying not to hedge in this question because I think SB 2 was such an important bill to pass. Whether or not it's actually going to have that exact problem which you're expressing here, that they're actually, it's going to be moribund, it's going to be sclerotic because there's not going to be that many cases for them to look at. We'll see.